Eamon Coghlan may not be a name that you are familiar with, but in the 1980s, he was one of the best runners in the world. He had a few different world records. He was the world champion a few different times, and his nickname was Chairman of the Boards because he was such a great runner on the indoor track that was typically made out of plywood. However, in 1987, at the championships in Indianapolis, Indiana, they were running at 1,500 meters, and it was just a preliminary heat. And Eamon Coghlan, he had about 1/3 of the race to go. He was sure to get a qualifying time in order to make it to the finals that year. However, with about 1/3 of the race remaining, Eamon Coghlan fell down. He got back up really quickly. He worked really hard, got back up to the lead of the race, and again was assured a qualifying spot in the finals. However, just as he was coming down the home stretch, just before he crossed the finish line, Eamon Coghlan looked over his shoulder to check to see if anyone was behind him. And just as he did that, he slowed up just for a split second, and a runner passed him. And Eamon Coghlan, the world record holder, the current world champion, failed to even qualify for the finals in 1987. All because he looked over his shoulder. As we talk about time this week, I fear that a lot of us, sometimes we lose sight of the time that God has given us today because we're too busy looking over our shoulders. Some of us look back to our past and we live with guilt over our past errors, our past sins, the ways in which we lived foolishly in the past, and we carry that guilt into today and we can't seem to get over it. Or sometimes we look back to our past and look not just at our guilt, but sometimes at our greatness and all the great things that we accomplished, and we find ourselves living in the past and not living for today. In Philippians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul addressed this issue. In verse 13, he says, "One thing I do, forgetting what is behind and reaching forward to what is ahead." Now, prior to that verse, the Apostle Paul was talking about all the great things that he had done in his life. And he said, I forget about those things that are behind because I want to live for today. Now, I'm not saying we ought to forget about our past. I'm saying that we should learn from the events of our past. But when we begin to live in our past, we lose time today. And so I want to encourage you that if you're living with guilt, remember that Jesus has forgiven all those things in the past. If you're living for the greatness in the past, be reminded of the great things that God wants to do today. And make the most of your time today because God has given you the gift of time today in order to use it for your good and for His glory.